Nuclear weapons are the deadliest weapons available in a country's arsenal. They are capable of wiping out entire cities and killing millions of people. Nuclear weapons are classified by the United Nations as an indiscriminate weapon. This means that it kills without distinction between a military and a civilian target. There are currently 14,500 nuclear weapons in the world. Most of them belong to the United States and Russia. But why are there so many? To understand this, we have to look at our history. During World War II, the United States was surprise attacked by Japan. The US declared war and slowly captured island after island until they had Japan surrounded. However, the Japanese government refused to surrender. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The Japanese still refused to surrender. 3 days later, the US dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. Finally, on August 14, 1945, the Japanese surrendered. To this day, the US is the only country to use a nuclear weapon on another. But this action created much tension. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two superpowers. Tensions between the two nations raised as they both tried to instill their ideas of government on other, smaller countries. The Soviet Union set up communist governments in between them and Western Europe. Eventually, they constructed the Berlin Wall to try and keep their citizens from moving to Western Europe. Meanwhile, the US believed in the domino theory. This is the ideology that if one country became communist, then the others around it would as well. Both superpowers tried to instill their own ideals in other countries and supported armed movements. This caused several satellite wars, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Besides these sponsored wars, the US and USSR participated in economical and technological races, for example, the space race and the arms race. In response to the US using the atomic bomb on Japan, the USSR developed the hydrogen bomb in 1953. This triggered an arms race in which each country tried to produce more nuclear bombs than the other. Another competition was the space race. It was believed that whoever controlled space would show the world which country had the best science, technological, and economic system. On October 4th, 1957, the USSR won the space race when it launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, and the first man-made object to be placed into Earth's orbit. Sputnik's launch came as a surprise, and not as pleasant one to most Americans. In response, the Americans launched Explorer 1 in 1958. This went back and forth until the US ended the space race by landing on the moon in 1969. The most infamous conflict in the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the US learned that the Soviet Union was about to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy ordered a blockade to be set up around Cuba in order to prevent the USSR from deploying their missiles. But little did the US know, the Soviet Union had submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes. When the blockade detected a submarine, they would drop practice depth charges, or PDCs. These were meant to signal to the submarines that they had been detected and should surface. However, the blasts damaged the submarines' radios and terrified the crews. Although the US informed Moscow on this tactic, the message was not able to be relayed to the submarines. On October 27, 1962, a B-59 submarine was forced to submerge and was pelted by PDCs. Unable to communicate with Moscow, Captain Valentin Savitsky concluded that war had already broken out. Savitsky ordered the crew to arm his submarine's nuclear torpedo and prepare it for firing. His political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, concurred with the order. Normally, the approval of these two officers would have sufficed to launch the torpedo, but by coincidence, Arkhipov, chief of staff of the 69th Brigade, happened to be on board, and he was entitled to say. According to some accounts, Arkhipov argued at length with Savitsky before the latter calmed down and ordered the B-59 to surface. Kennedy ultimately moved towards resolving the crisis on October 28th with a secret deal suggested by Khrushchev, in which the United States withdrew missiles in Turkey and promised not to invade Cuba, in exchange for the USSR withdrawing its nuclear weapons. The Cold War came to an end in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Due to these events, today's countries are arming themselves with a weapon stronger than nukes, the threat of mutually assured destruction. People believe that if they also have some nuclear weapons, then a potential attacker will hesitate because they will also be destroyed. While this worked in the Cold War, it is a passive approach to peace and only makes tensions higher because there's even bigger threat of global annihilation. Countries will continue to feel unsafe and want to protect themselves if this course continues. It only takes one nuke to start all-out war. The world needs a more active approach to peace. There is a common misconception of peace. People believe that if there is no war, then we are at peace. This is not true because there is still a threat of war. Peace is the absence of war and the absence of tensions and conflict. But how do we achieve this peace? The answer is in our world leaders and governments. The governments built the nukes, so the governments should be responsible for making sure that they never have to be used. Our leaders need to negotiate peace with each other and create a world where countries do not need nuclear weapons to feel safe. Global organizations like the United Nations need to hold conferences to inform leaders about the real threat of war. But most of all, people need to be informed. People must know what is threatening their livelihoods. The people must go to their leaders and express their concerns. We must share our information with those who are less informed and get them to join the fight for peace and nuclear disarmament.